Hey everybody, welcome to a podcast about what the hell's an RPG. I'm here with the Hypocrite.
That's me.
So we were in the procrastinators chat, and our buddy the Devu was talking about this concept of the alternative RPG, talking about games like Earthbound and the Mario Superstar Saga and Lisa and Undertale, all these games that are kind of in this lineage. And you were sort of wondering, what is an alternative RPG alternative to?
Yeah, because I was just having trouble, because, like, I'm a person who has trouble understanding, like, genre things, like labels, when it comes to games, at least, because I like things to be completely, like, straightforward language. This is literally what this sort of genre means, and I don't know what everybody agrees on.
Yeah, RPGs have kind of a complicated history because it's both a thing where a lot of stuff falls under the umbrella of RPG, and there's also a lot of disagreement about it. Personally, I'm going to come at this from a descriptive language standpoint, as in, how do people use the term? Because a lot of people will say, like, a role-playing game should be a game where you play a role. It should be just like the Dungeons and Dragons or something. And it's
I understand that language changes, so it like, I understand the basic idea that RPG is usually in a fantasy setting, and you usually level up, but not always. And that's basically how I think of it. But I don't know how to think of, like, the alternative to that necessarily. Yeah. Like, do you not level up? Is that it?
Well, no. See, and that's the thing. The way that we're using this term alt RPG is, like, really not mechanically different at all. It's more about an attitude thing. And so, but to give context to that, I'm going to have to go way the hell back. Because I think RPG basically breaks down to two different distinct lineages. You've got Western RPGs and JRPGs.
Yeah.
And I think Western RPGs, there's even though there's a lot of different styles of it, you can very definitively tell, like, what they're going for. They feel more like pen and paper tabletop games. You know, it owes a lot more to that old Dungeons and Dragons style, where there's usually an element of, like, character building, like, different stat management and stuff like that. Like, I am a rogue, and therefore I'm going to put all my points into rogue maneuvers and stuff, like, there's that element hanging in the background. So when you play, like, say, a Bethesda game, or a Fallout type, well, that's also Bethesda, now that I think about it, but, like, there's all the classic, like, top-down ones, the shit like that.
So it's like, you say lineage, like, this is born from Western tabletop, and then Japanese ones are born from what?
I mean, I'd say that they both owe a lineage to Western tabletop games, but JRPGs more clearly descend from, like, the Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest camp, where there was this style of RPG that came about, which is like the turn-based ones, where it's like you are an adventurer on a quest and you level up in a much more linear way. You just kind of get stronger. There's not so much the putting points into this and that, and it has less of the actual, like, when people think role-playing, there's less of that, like, I'm building the character to my specific needs. Less customization, that's the word I'm looking for, But there's plenty of JRPGs that have elements of that. It's just that when you look at a JRPG, you can usually say, okay, this clearly descended from Dragon Warrior or Final Fantasy, because it has that same kind of turn-based battles, that same kind of, like, world exploration, where it's like, you start in a starting town, you have starting armor, then you go to the next town, you get you get the next stage of armor, you get the next stage of your adventure, and it's like this clear linear progression, whereas Western RPGs kind of evolved into more of the open world stuff that we've got now, where it's like, just run around and fucking do whatever you want, and there's a lot more emphasis on choice and stuff like that. So that's where you get, like, your wastelands and stuff like that, which are, like, heavy into choice and customization.
So I think what you're getting at is that alternate RPGs are more based on, like, the JRPG side of things, because I don't think there exists, like, a Western style different sort of RPG. Okay.
I would say that it's definitely rare. I haven't seen any Western RPGs that, like, fundamentally break formula. I mean, unless you count, because like these games like Lisa and Undertale, like they are Western games. They
Well,
just
I mean,
clearly come from
I would
the,
argue that Dark Souls is definitely a Western RPG.
yeah,
So,
in some
and that's
ways,
made in Japan.
certainly.
So yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, and I mean, Dark Souls also, yeah, Dark Souls definitely owes a lot to Western RPG styles. It's definitely based on more of the tabletop thing. I mean, it owes a lot to like Call of Cthulhu, which is a classic tabletop game. And it borrows a lot of the iconography and stuff of that. Which again, not to say that JRPGs don't. Plenty of them have homage to those older games, but it just isn't the intention. Like you can tell that Dark Souls is supposed to be, you customize a character, there's a huge amount of freedom, it's more open world. It definitely has more in common with like a Fallout game than it does with a Final Fantasy game.
Yeah.
So I would say that like with Western RPGs, you then also have say strategy games, tactic games, and those are kind of, there's almost a Western Eastern split, except not, because with Western games you usually have the real-time strategy games, like Red Faction, is that what it's called? What were you gonna say?
Well, I was thinking you were about to talk about like things like Fire Emblem, which I associate with more Japanese things, but they're turn-based, so
right. So that's what I'm there. That's the distinction, that the Western games were usually more real-time strategy. Eastern games were usually more turn-based. There's been plenty of bleed over from both, though. Like it's pretty common for there to be Western turn-based strategy games like XCOM, which is really popular in the last few years, and Japan has made some real-time ones like Grim Grimoire, which is a two-dimensional real-time strategy game on the PS2. How the fuck does that work? Nobody knows, but but it's supposedly a good game. I do own it, haven't played it. So then you've also got action RPGs, which kind of are an obvious, like obviously what they mean is just like it's not turn-based, but it has the level up systems, the grinding, the same kind of progression as you go. And yeah, I think that's what makes Dark Souls in particular interesting, is that like Western RPGs, the modern ones definitely have a strong element of like action RPG-ness. Like if you look at say Skyrim, you would think of that as an action RPG because you're fighting enemies directly. But I also think that if I were to make a distinction between action RPG and Western RPG, the distinction I would make is that an action RPG relies more on the skill and less on stats. Like in Dark Souls, you can beat the game with at level 1. You don't have to level up. You don't have to participate in the RPG element per se. You can just on sheer skill get through the game.
I'm trying to think of whether games other than Dark Souls even have that ability, like whether you can play, say, God of War without leveling up or gaining any power-ups. I don't even know how God of War works, but
God of War is definitely almost a borderline thing. I mean, a game like that, I don't know if you like, I'm trying to think if God of War has like mandatory level ups, like if it just happens through force of playing the game. That one definitely has like little RPG elements, and that's it's a common phrase, RPG elements. Like every action game has them now, where you can level up your guns in Tomb Raider now, it's stuff. So there's definitely elements of it, but those games are so distant from the appeal of RPGs that no one's gonna say, oh, that's an action RPG. It's like like Dark Souls, you can play it like an RPG and it still makes sense. But then in a game like Elder Scrolls, like especially if you look at Morrowind, in that game you can just whiff on an enemy. Like you can see your spear go into an enemy and it can say the word miss, because it's based on stats. It's not based on your skill at dodging and weaving and stuff. Like it's completely stat based. Whereas in Dark Souls, if you see the sword hit the enemy, it's a hit. No matter what.
So where would things like Kingdom Hearts and the later Final Fantasies, where the sort of it's not turn based, it's action RPG kind of, like what?
I would definitely call those action RPGs. And yeah.
I don't know how they play. Well, I know the first Kingdom Hearts. I think of it as a JRPG though, just because of the way that it's, it's very Japanese.
I mean, it is a JRPG, just not turn based. I mean, that's the thing. JRPG is a very broad term. Like, but when we think of it, we often think of turn based games, and I mean that's a distinction to be made in itself. There's turn based and there's other stuff. Really, JRPG just refers to a game from Japan, so it's not even really a genre term per se.
Well, I
But
think
then,
I have like a distinct thought in my head when I think JRPG, and it's usually to do with either an anime protagonist or like an RPG where not necessarily turn-based, but you're controlling more than one character. Like you have
yeah,
party allies, whereas in a Western one, it's usually just you on your own doing quests for people. But then,
yeah.
even then, you can have parties in Western RPGs. So I don't know. I just think of like a party of people as a JRPG as opposed to a Western one.
Yeah, it's interesting to try to make these distinctions, and I personally think that we could possibly use more genre terms like action RPG because of that difference between Morrowind and Dark Souls, where like one is stat based and one's not. Like I almost feel like those should be two different genres because I think the appeal is different of those two. Like if I told you I'm big into action RPGs and I mean games like Dark Souls, I might not like an Elder Scrolls game necessarily, you know. So,
Well, yeah. I mean, I feel like people don't refer to Elder Scrolls as an action RPG, even though it does have
Yeah.
action in it, because they don't associate that with, like, I think people associate action RPG with, like, third-person camera action, as opposed to,
Yeah.
and I feel like these labels, I think there's enough, parts of the labels, like action can mean a certain thing when paired with another word. I think people
Right.
need to start either, making big long words like it's German. Like you just add all the different like labels onto each other to make a huge word, or just use them like tags or something to accurately,
Yeah.
more accurately describe what the game is like, instead of just having a term that you can say in a trailer, or as a brief summary, because you can't really summarize everything within a couple words.
Right. Where it gets really interesting to me breaking down the difference in action RPG styles is when you look at MMOs, because like you look at a game like World of Warcraft or Final Fantasy 11 or 14, and those games again, like positioning matters, but it's another one where you can whiff when you see your character hit something. And then you've got like Terra Online and Black Desert and those kinds of games where even though it does still have that whiffing mechanic, like that's a part of it, hit detection does matter a lot more. And like one of the big selling points of Terra was, hey, if you're good enough, you can fight the big ass monsters by yourself. You know, like this is an RPG, you should come with a party, but if you're crazy fucking skilled and really patient, you can do it, just like in Dark Souls, you know? And so with that, it really becomes a question of like, is this an action RPG or not? Because it's not quite Dark Souls level of like, you can do it at level 1. Like, you wouldn't want to. It's crazy to try, but at the same time, you can. So like, they're clearly trying to blend those two appeals into one, play. So where the hell do we qualify that? You know, I played it solo, so I certainly played. I mean, I teamed up when I had to, but
Yeah, I guess I don't know. It's so confusing to me that it's just the only real thing you can do is just have somebody describe it, and then if just look at videos of it and pictures and
Yeah.
understand for yourself before you buy it or whatever, because trying to simplify it all down into a phrase or a word is just not possible with the amount of different ways you can make games and the amount of
Yeah.
creativity in the whole medium.
I mean, to me, the reason to use a genre term should never be for the sake of describing a game. It's for describing a lineage. It's like trying to figure out what, like when we're trying to look at it in the grand scheme of things, and this is why I was so into Devu's idea of creating this alternative RPG title, because when you look at Lisa or Undertale, those games are very clearly trying to be like this certain type of RPG, like Earthbound and Mother 3, the whole Mother series, and like Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga and stuff, and like all of those fall into this category of like these they're kind of like a turn-based RPG, except they've got this other element. Like they're just played a little differently. They've got a different sense of humor. They're not set in the same kind of worlds or telling the same kinds of stories. Like when you look at most JRPGs, they tend to, even if they're not like a high fantasy setting or sci-fi or something, they usually start off in the small town. You know, it's about you are just a normal guy who goes on a big adventure, and in the end you kill God. Like, that's almost always the ending, is you go, eventually you get more and more powerful, and then you kill God. And even in Undertale, arguably the same thing happens, you know, but it's more about these characters and this odd world and this like you know, thematic narrative. It has less to do with the basic bare bones JRPG storyline, and it definitely falls more in line with like Earthbound, where, and again, in that game you do technically start off from a small town and go on to kill God, but that small town is a suburban city in Japan, and you know, so it's like it's still an RPG.
So it's less about the mechanics and more about like an alternative narrative, an alternative way of storytelling, as opposed to, you know, a different way to play a game.
Definitely. Like, for instance, if I were to, like, there's definitely some RPGs that have a totally different combat system. I mean, like Final Fantasy, for instance, the last like 5 games all have completely different systems from each other, but they all feel like a Final Fantasy game. You know, you still have that feeling of like it's about this big expansive world that's really well detailed, this fantasy world that you're on an epic adventure through. You gather a party of these, you know, these certain individuals who join you on your quest to go kill God and bring down the system, or fight whatever the big evil is. And these other games, the alternative ones, again, they have all that, but it's skinned in a different way. It doesn't feel the same. It feels like it's about something different, you know. And I mean, even if you were to say that it's basically the same thing, it's just clear that the appeal is different. Like the kinds of people who love an Earthbound game, who really resonate with those games, are probably not the giant Final Fantasy fans, you know. Like it's just like a different kind of crowd or a different kind of mindset it's bringing to the table. And I think that the only reason it's interesting to categorize it that way is to look at the lineage and go like, hey, these games are all shooting for this atmosphere that is deliberately different, you know, but different in the same way. Like, they're not just totally off-the-wall games. Each one is, like, directly paying homage to this particular style that Earthbound, you know, popularized. So,
well,
or...
Devu put Super Mario RPG in the... I mean, that is basically just a straight RPG. You go and you kill God, you start off with a small town, but you're Mario, and it's in the Mushroom Kingdom, and... But I feel like that's more of a normal RPG, and the thing that's different about it is the mechanics, where you're pressing buttons to time jumps and stuff.
I don't know if Devu's played Mario RPG. I don't remember if he has played the original. It's definitely not as quirky and offbeat as like Superstar Saga is, you know, where Superstar Saga is all about the goofy plot with all these like... It's more about the characters and seeing this really different world that's not like a fantasy world. It's all like these really unique locations. They go to a bean kingdom, you know, as opposed to any kind of traditional fantasy location. Whereas with Mario RPG, I do think part of the point of it was to be a Final Fantasy game with Mario, you know, because it was made by Square Enix. And
it's not like... I mean, it's funny. It's got some funny moments, but it's more just light-hearted seriousness.
Yeah, I'd say, because there's definitely a broad category. Like, not every JRPG is, like, totally serious. You know, they're not all, like, grim and everything. But then some of them are, like, clearly just doing the RPG thing. But, hey, it's toned down a little bit. Hey, it's not as much gravity. I mean, Chrono Trigger has lots of funny stuff in it, you know. You've played Chrono Trigger.
Yeah. I've played a lot of it, but not all of it.
Right.
But it's got a grim future, but there's a lot of funny little moments.
Yeah, there's lots of quirky stuff. There's lots of weird little things, but when you look at that compared to Earthbound, which like literally just takes place in contemporary Japan, it's like this game is not even like Chrono Trigger is. This is a high fantasy world, but it has its own unique little Akira Toriyama stuff going on. You know, it's like a Dragon Ball a little bit. But then Earthbound is like, this is not trying to resemble a conventional RPG. It just happens to have those systems, and in a way, it's almost making fun of an RPG by having those systems. You know.
All right. When you said lineage earlier, I wasn't really fully grasping it because I felt like you were just talking about lineage, as in Mother 3 is a new lineage. But now I kind of get it that all these other RPGs have their own lineage from like Final Fantasy 1, and all the Western ones have a Dungeons and Dragons lineage.
Right.
So it's really just like seeing like the genres are, where did they get their ideas?
Exactly.
And what feeling that the authors are trying to convey. Not necessarily how they're doing it, but like, you know, it's like, an emotion thing.
Which is exactly why, like, we have such a hard time calling Dark Souls a JRPG. Just because, like, even though you know it's Japanese, you're looking at it and you're like, everything about this screams Western. You know, like, screams Western influence. Like, it's the stat trees, the open world, the fact that it takes place in a fucking... Everyone speaks English, even in the Japanese version of the game. You know? Like...
I forget... You made that big old video, what is anime and what isn't, and I forget whether you came away with the idea that if something is made in Japan, it's Japanese.
Yeah.
Because it's weird where it could be made in various places that aren't exactly just Japan. So Dark Souls, if we're going by lineage, would you say Avatar is anime? If it's like lineagely, like it's inspired by that sort of stuff?
Avatar definitely has an anime lineage. The problem is simply that it's not only that, you know? Like, when it comes to, and this is the same, like, I'm not going to come out and say Dark Souls is not a JRPG or that it is a Western RPG, because the problem is that even though, yes, it's using tons of Western RPG elements, there's still this distinctly Japanese nature to it. Like, just the peculiar things about it that wouldn't probably, like the Onion Knight. Like, you can't imagine a Western RPG with, like, this weird kind of goofy, derpy character. It's like such a Japanese idea, you know? So like there's, or like the mushroom monsters, which, I mean, in fairness, Morrowind famously was about a world of mushrooms, but like, you know, the fact that it's these big mushrooms that fist punch you, you know, like that's such a Japanese kind of creativity that it's hard to just say, like, if you just put Dark Souls in the hands.
I feel like the fact that there's the words Western and Japanese in those titles of RPGs is unhelpful, because you think about the country rather than the way the game is. Like, I still think of Dark Souls as a Western RPG because that's clearly what the influence was. It was made by a Japanese team, so they have like their own Japanese twist, spin on it, quirk, whatever you want to say. But it's still like, it's made to be a Western RPG, and I would think if a Western game, like let's say Undertale, say the alternate RPG label doesn't exist yet, and Undertale you would think of as a JRPG kind of, because it's
I tend to call it like that, even though it's not. Yeah,
it's made by a Westerner, so it's like the country shouldn't really come into it. It can add the own unique culture, a little flavor to it, but I feel like if the intention is to carry on a lineage from a certain genre, that's what it is.
And I mean, part of the question also comes down to who the audience is, though, because like with Dark Souls, even though it's clearly Western influenced, I do think it's made for Japanese players, and so that brings its own questions. But yeah, I think it would be better if it wasn't called Western and JRPG. Like if we remade the terms to something that accounts for the fact that it's global now. Like my problem with calling Avatar anime is that the only reason anime even makes sense as a term is that there's anime fans. Like there's people who specifically like just cartoons from Japan, and that's why they bother to make that distinction. And when you look at Avatar, even though it has a lot of influence from anime, I mean, they literally told the people who made that show, the guys who directed it, like they made it mandatory that anybody working on the show had to watch Fooly Cooly, That was part of the creation process, and you can tell when you watch the show. There's lots of fooly cooly nods in the animation, but at the same time, you know it's made for a Western audience, and part of that is all the mouths move on time with the characters talking. Like, that's considered a thing that matters in the West and not in Japan. And when Japan makes shows that are for a Western audience, they will make the characters' mouths move more accurately to the speech because they think that Americans care about it for some reason. So, like, there's elements of it that you look at it and you say, well, okay, this is clearly influenced by anime, but is it anime when it also is clearly made for, Americans?
Well, now I think
has
for that
concessions
we would need, new labels, like to account for the audience. So you just tag on the end of whatever it is, like for Westerners, for Japanese people, for Mongolians. I don't know.
Yeah.
Like if that really does change the like.
I mean,
it's not just that. It's like it's the country who makes it plus who they're making it for. I mean, say for example, like a French show made for Australians. Like I don't know what they think of. I don't know what the French think of Australia, but maybe they have like an opinion of them that would influence the way they make art for Australia.
Yeah.
And that would just be it's just so many fucking tags.
Right. If I was going to do Dark Souls all in one go, I would just call it a Japanese action RPG with a heavy Western RPG influence. Like, that's how I'd describe it if I was trying to say, like, someone asked me, what is Dark Souls? Like, in genre terms. It's a Japanese action RPG with a heavy Western RPG influence. So if you understand Western RPGs and action RPGs, you'll more or less understand what Dark Souls is, while also accounting for the fact that it is Japanese.
Yeah, but even then, the sort of person who would understand all those things and what context, like they would need to understand what Japanese people think of Westerners and how they would make something for them and what they do and how Western then you would need all that context to be able to dissect or decode that genre tags. So to the point where it's just not going to be useful.
Well,
in
that's
real life.
The thing is that genre tags, and this is a funny thing that I think is weirdly misunderstood, because everybody thinks of genre tags in terms of like recommendations, and I think that's the polar opposite of how they should be used. Genre tags should be strictly academic. Like, the whole reason they exist, there was this thing that this guy wrote years ago where he was trying to justify why metal is broken down into so many different genres, because metal music is just a hell of genre distinctions. And he was saying that he looked at it from a scientific standpoint. Like, when we talk about animals, we talk about their phylum, their species, like we go down the list of what, like, classifications of like what leads us down to this animal, and genres are similar, where like the people who genres are most helpful to are people who understand the biggest picture, who are trying to put everything into categories and understand how all of it's connected. Whereas guy who doesn't know anything about the genre, don't tell him what genre it is, just give him the game. Because for him he's just gonna go, what is an action RPG? Yeah, just play this game, you'll like it.
Yeah, I would prefer people to stop using genre tags and start using them just for academia, because it really gets confusing when I try not to use them because I think that they're confusing, and everybody else uses them because that's just how everybody talks about them, and I just don't know what to think a lot of the time, so I end up not deciding to do anything based on what people are saying. Like, I never get interested in a game based on the genre, because I know I think differently about it than everyone else.
Yeah, and it can be really unhelpful for that reason. And the funny thing about me is I simultaneously, this goes for not just video games but everything, I simultaneously know everything about genres, and I think they are stupid and I hate them. Because, like, if you try to describe something if I made a video analyzing a show, and I'm like, oh, it's this genre. Like, all I'm doing is putting a bunch of really broad ideas in my audience's head that they have their own thoughts about, as you just said. Like, if I open up a video, oh, this is a JRPG, then, like, they're gonna bring all their assumptions about what a JRPG is into my video. I'd rather leave that completely off the table and just describe what the thing is, like, what it is, not what it belongs to, but what it is. And then, in the privacy of my own mind or in an academic circle, I could talk about where it fits into a lineage, or in a separate video. Like, yeah, I don't think it's helpful to in general, like, tell somebody a genre, like, because everybody understands it differently. Unless you really get the genre. Like, if there's somebody who's really, really deep into one specific genre, and then you show them this game and you say, hey, this game's in that genre you like, then that person will probably, but they'll probably already know about it. So, who cares?
Yeah. It's really only a problem when it's like a reviewer using it because they think that it's helpful. When it kind of is. A lot of the time, there's a reason people keep using it. It's because everyone seems to have like a generic understanding of what a thing is. A first-person shooter. Well, you shoot guns, and the gun's right in front of the camera. Like, people know that.
It's just shocking how often I disagree with, like so often I start a video and a guy gives a genre description, and I immediately am just like, well, we already see things differently, so this is going to be a hard sell that you know what you're talking about, because
it really annoys me when
that genre.
When people just lead in with, like, they have the information dump of various things that they feel like they need to say about whatever they're talking about, instead of just explaining the broad appeals and then going into details. That's what I'd rather people just explain, like, in human English, in real speak.
Yeah.
What is the appeal of this thing that you're showing me? Just tell me.
And lately, what I've been really into is like the genres that aren't really any kind of hard definition, but are more of a feeling. Which, like, this alternative RPG is definitely more of that. It's not something you can easily define. It's more of like, you look at those games when they're all next to each other, and you look at them next to each other, you'll go, okay, that looks about right. Like, I understand how all those games are connected, and why they don't fit into the same category as, like, a Final Fantasy. And this has been kind of a thing, like, that's great for chart threads on 4chan, like, on V, where they'll have something like comfy games. And it's like, it's any genre, it doesn't matter. All that matters is that it has the atmosphere of comfy, And, like, when you see them all next to each other, you go, yeah, those are comfy games. Yeah! And then you go play all of them. So, which, incidentally, I have that chart. It's great.
Yeah.
Alright, I think we've kind of gotten to the bottom of this. Is there any other questions you wanted to ask me about, like, specific RPGs? How would you categorize them?
I was trying to think of, like, before I realized that you were talking about, like, an emotional thing instead of mechanics. I was thinking about that one RPG, which is like a rhythm game in a dungeon. I forget what it's called, where you dance around.
Crypt of the Necrodancer.
Yeah, like,
that's a roguelite.
Oh yeah,
not an RPG at all. It's a whole other, which I think Rogue is maybe a subset of RPGs, like a subset of an action RPG, but
it would be a subset of, like, D&D Western RPGs in a sense, because you are playing a rogue character. It's a game based on one class of a thing, I guess.
Well, the idea of a roguelike is that it's a game where you go through you only have one life. If you die, you start over. And you basically collect items along your way, and so each run is different. Like, fundamentally, it's like a randomized level. So, for instance, The Binding of Isaac. Like, you start off, and it's even though it's the same format of a dungeon, it's always a different layout with different items. So every time you play, you'll have a different experience, but if you die, you start all over. And it's all about getting through the game in one shot. Now, it used to be roguelike, but because so many of them are not really that similar to the actual game Rogue, which is where that genre term comes from, there's now also the term roguelite, which means a roguelike, but it's different enough from Rogue that it feels weird to call it that,
Whatever. You cut
Which
out.
in Japan, there's a whole like category of mystery dungeon games, like Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, which are all roguelike, except that they're like it's one specific template of a roguelike, which is just applied to like every different fucking franchise out there. You've got like Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, Chocobo Mystery Dungeon, or Nariki Dungeon as it's called in Japan. It's a huge subgenre.
So what would I guess Pokemon would just be a normal RPG because
I was thinking about that on the way here because I just went to the store before we started this. I was thinking about it while I was in the car, and yeah, Pokemon's kind of just a regular turn-based RPG, but the main central conceit of it is the gigantic party that you can have 150 different characters in your party.
Yeah.
So I think that there should be a category called massive party RPGs.
so Pokemon Lights essentially.
Yeah. Well, even
because there's the Dragon Quest monster games which are very Pokemon-esque.
And even
and
predating
there's the Yokai Watch, I think that's similar.
Yeah, that's similar. Even predating that, Suikoden, like the Suikoden games are closer to a typical RPG, but one of the main selling points is that you can have 104 different party members. Like you don't need most of them, but like if you go out of your way and side quests and stuff, you can gather a huge party. So like, yeah, there's definitely a whole category of these, like, and really Shin Megami Tensei falls into this as well, because in the Shin Megami Tensei games, you are a devil summoner, and the idea is it's pretty much Pokemon. You collect devils and they join your team, and then you can fuse them into new devils, and it's all about, like, collecting and trading them, essentially. The Persona games have an element of it, but with the Persona games, it's like you have a core party, and then they also have their devils, you know, or their personas. But I would say Persona's closer to a typical turn-based JRPG, and that one also could be considered an alt RPG series because it takes place in contemporary Japan and is about interpersonal relationships, you know, as opposed to a big sweeping adventure. Most of them take place in one town, and yeah, so those ones are definitely pretty distinct. Any other ones you wanted to ask about or clarify?
No, I mean,
you were asking about Dark Cloud in the chat.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an action RPG in that there's no turns, and you know, you hit things and you level up, and you go on to kill the devil or god or whatever. Yeah. So it's kind of a normal RPG. It's just got like a weird city building element. Yeah,
it's got this whole other side of the game, which is interesting too because have you ever played or heard of Actraiser?
I think you Let's Played it once. No.
No, I did Soul Blazer, which is also has... Well, Soul Blazer has a town-building element, but you don't pick where the stuff goes. Like, every time you clear out a room in the dungeon, then something shows up in the town, but it's always linear in the way it's done. Actraiser is a game that's one part side-scrolling, like, action platformer, like Castlevania style, although I think there's also, like, a leveling up system. But it's, like, one part side-scrolling platformer, and then you go into a Dark Cloud style city builder. So it's like just two wholly different genres that are blended into one in the same way, but not quite the same genre. Yeah, it's odd. What a couple of weird games. Like, how would you describe Dark Cloud to somebody? I guess you just say it's an action RPG that also has a city builder inside of it.
Yeah, there's no word to combine those two.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. Well, fun podcast. Thanks for coming on, Hippo. I guess
Thank
I'll post
you.
This
I now know more stuff.
Yeah, the more you know. And if anybody wants me to do fucking in-depth genre diatribes on something else, just let me know. I like doing this stuff because this is the kind of fucking stupid, useless knowledge that I have an endless wealth of. So, yeah.
I won't be there for that. I'm just here because I was confused about things.
All right. Peace.
See ya.